Good afternoon. My name is Tom Suter. I am the founder of the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We've got a great topic for you, protecting against ransomware in federal agencies. It's kind of all been in the news, and it's something that's a very important topic to our federal government colleagues. Once again, welcome to all the attendees. Special thanks to Swish, Commvault, the NetApp teams that kind of helped us put this program together, and we're really excited to do this today. So we're going to have each of the panelists kind of speak about what after some introductions, they're going to speak about what they know about this topic. We are going to then have poll questions. We're going to be engaging with the audience, and I think you're in for a great afternoon. So if I can get all our panelists to come on live, that'd be fantastic. Great. And so we'll do a little quick round of introductions. Let's see. I think we're waiting for Lee to come on. Great. And Richard. So I'll just go around the horn and just say hello, and then we'll go into each of the panelists giving their kind of like mini TED Talk, as we call it. But in no particular order, we'll go with Sean Applegate with Swish Data, and Sean is the Chief Technology Officer. How are you doing today, Sean?
Doing great, Tom. Thanks for inviting us to the panel today.
Yeah, no problem. And where are you operating out of today? It looks like your house, huh?
Yeah, we're down south near Fredericksburg, Virginia today.
Fantastic, fantastic. And then we also have William Burke, Deputy Chief Vulnerability Evaluation at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, of course, CISA, inside of DHS. How are you doing today, William?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Good, good. I actually had a meeting earlier today. I was over by the Ballston. I don't know if you work out of the Ballston office, but I was down that way.
Oh, good deal.
Great. And we also have with us Lee Kim, and she's got a long title, so buckle up here for a second. She's got a lot going on. Director of Privacy and Security, Thought Advisory, Interim Senior Counsel, Data Protection Officer, Healthcare Information and Management Systems Society, and also another role at the National Cybersecurity Training and Education Center, National Visiting Committee at National Science Foundation, and team leader and member at the Analytic Exchange Program at DHS. How are you doing today, Lee?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
And great. And where are you find yourself today?
I'm currently out of Pittsburgh.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's originally where I'm from. So I'm kind of a big Steeler fan. But yes, I was born and raised in Pittsburgh until I moved to Virginia. Right. So I'm a big Pittsburgh person, and they've done some wonderful things with the city, and they've got Carnegie Mellon, and I should be like on their board of anytime we get a chance, we'd like to promote Pittsburgh. And last but not least, we have with us Richard Breakiron, who's Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives for America's Public Sector at Commvault. How are you doing today, Richard?
Hey, I'm doing well today, Tom. And since I know you're asking the question, I'm sitting at the Quantico Cyber Hub, just at Quantico, Virginia, and we're having a major event and walkthrough with the Marines. It's a groundbreaking ceremony for the next building that they're building here, supporting sort of a public-private partnership. So great to be here. It's funny, the second time I've done an ATARC event was a couple months ago, and I happened to be here for another event down here. So it seems like we've got the battle cadence going.
You know, I really like that center there. I was there a few weeks ago. I actually have a meeting there tomorrow morning. So I'm catching the tail end of some folks that are still in town. I couldn't make it today. I was a little busy with this webinar thing, so I wasn't able to make it down.
I can understand. Maybe I need to go downstairs and grab Dr. Ray Latier. He was the guest speaker at the FCO luncheon today.
Yeah, he's fantastic. I actually ran into him recently. So anyway, let's move on with our webinar. Good to see everybody. Why don't we start off with, I'd love to get your perspectives on this topic. At CISA, it'd be good to hear about your role there and how CISA is working on this issue and getting the information out.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm essentially here to kind of give that offensive look at ransomware in terms of the panel itself.
But as mentioned, I'm the deputy chief at Vulnerability Evaluations, and what we do in our section is give an offensive perspective on defensive operations. So we primarily provide two services, the risk and vulnerability assessment and the remote penetration test. The risk and vulnerability assessment, being a 2-week assessment, covers an external and internal attacker's perspective on an organization. And the RPT, the remote penetration test, is a kind of condensed, external only kind of look. And we provide these services for federal, state, local, tribal, territorial, critical infrastructure key resource, private and public side of the fence. So in the last year, I want to say we conducted just a bit over 400 assessments. And again, that's over federal, SLTT, or CIKR. And a big thing that we look at in doing these assessments is that whole perspective. So we don't look at one or two particular things. We don't look at a particular framework when we do our testing. We kind of take that attacker's perspective, the attacker's methodology, and apply it externally, apply it internally, see what types of resources we can access, how far we can escalate our privileges. And along the whole way, because it is only a 2-week assessment, we are coordinating, with the individuals on the other side of the fence, and keeping them in the loop of what's going on. But at the end, we kind of compile all that information and give it as a report to help them enhance their overall security posture. In addition to relaying any of those findings in a anonymized form back to our central area where it can be analyzed for kind of State of the Union level findings.
That's fantastic. Just a real quick question. How do you get into the mind of the attackers? That sounds like a kind of a fun job if you're like a cyber geek. How do you do that?
So a couple different ways. We all come from different backgrounds. Some of us did this in the military. Some of this have trained for it from the university side of the fence. But in terms of the perspective itself, so to speak, it's kind of a combination of different things. So I would say that a part of it is just in terms of what's out there in terms of intel, in terms of how the attackers are performing their methodologies, the techniques and tools that they're using. And some of it as well is also mapped to things like the MITRE attack path that kind of details different stages of attacks. As mentioned, we don't follow any particular or specific type of attack path. We kind of take an amalgamation of all the different things that are out there and do what we feel would be most successful from that attacker's perspective. So we leverage real world attack methodologies and capabilities, but we don't limit ourselves to specific capabilities to emulate specific actors. We kind of again take that big picture perspective on things.
Great. Next, let's go with you, Lee. It sounds like you're kind of like working with lots of different agencies, and it'd be great to hear with your perspectives from working for a bunch of different organizations.
Sure, thank you, Tom. So I can say that, essentially how the ransomware problem is perceived, it's been with us for obviously decades. It's certainly a significant threat to many. Obviously, the primary threat is by way of phishing. Phishing is such a basic topic. Generally, in terms of anyone I've interacted with, whenever you talk about phishing and the need for more security awareness, people just simply assume that they have it all down and everything. But nonetheless, it's still the primary means by which attackers are getting into our systems and, for example, deploying ransomware through some kind of malware-laden email, whether it's bad links or bad attachments or otherwise. And I have to say that no matter which agency you look at or which company for that matter, people, of course, as we all know, will always be the weakest link. And in today's world, in our virtual world where time is at a premium and our attention is really divided, the ability for us to detect unusual things, such as what you'd normally see in a phish, is greatly diminished. So through that carelessness or lack of attention to detail, that simply heightens the ability for an attacker to get in that way. And that said, in terms of ransomware itself and the controls in place, I have to say that generally, if you're dealing with a larger agency or entity of any kind, They're generally better equipped with better security programs, but the devil's in details, right? Sometimes there is a lack of coordination as to how cybersecurity is actually architected and run from unit to unit. And certainly in terms of things that need to be covered across the board, hopefully in terms of multi-factor authentication and encryption, for example, certainly see a large variation as to the level of deployment across entities and agencies just simply as a whole. Certainly things that we should believe now are basic. But it's getting better, but unfortunately, I don't think that we're information sharing as much or even getting trained as much as we need to be to stay ahead of threats.
Yeah, I'm thinking we ought to have a working group around this. It's getting to be more of a theme in the federal government, and we're seeing a lot more attacks. Richard, I know you work for a private company. What do you see across government, and also your company sees across? How is the financial sector going? How's the healthcare? What do you? I can't wait to hear what your perspectives are.
I appreciate that, Tom, and I think Lee hit some really good points, as did William as well. What we're finding across the board is we go out with a sort of a thought presentation right now. So many people look at security from a compliance perspective, and we actually go out with a simple presentation that we go out to. I did a recent presentation with a NATO group, and my first slide was simply saying, "Are you ready?" And everybody sort of just looks at you, and I go, "No." And then I reiterate, and I say, "No, are you really ready?" And then I bring up the number of attacks that occur every second across all networks. And you're right, within industry, within the health sector, within the financial sector, it is just a constant bombardment, and they are constantly trying to find a weak link. And the theme of this presentation really is you actually can be ready, but it's always a matter of when, not if. The attacks are always a matter, you are going to be attacked. And the key is the enemy gets a vote, the adversaries get a vote, and they keep coming up with more and more ways. Phishing attack continues to be one of those weakest links that you can never seem to defend against. And so when I talk about the are you ready, my comment is always, are you ready to recover? And that's one of the most important things. Operational readiness is not the fact that you lose the battle of the first attack or that the vulnerability that you didn't see gets exploited. It's the ability to restore and recover and get back operational. And that takes planning, and that takes effort ahead of time to make sure that you can recover. So I think that's what we're seeing heavily is a focus on the ability to recover, because I think everybody in industry realizes no matter how much money they spend in sensors, no matter how much time they spend in training and protection or automation, eventually it seems like there's a crack that somebody gets through. And the key is, it's sort of like a COVID crisis. If you can find that first incident, isolate it, quarantine it, and start then working on your recovery process, that's what's critical. And that's what we're seeing in industry really focus on, is as much on recovery as it is defense right now.
Yes, I know we're going to talk more about that with some follow-up questions. Sean, my friend, I know you see a lot as CTO of Switch Data, and you're all over the federal government with all your clients. Love to hear what you have to say on this.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Yeah, so one of the biggest challenges we see is the ability to respond quickly and then recover your data. So very much like Richard said, you will get compromised. It's just a matter of time. You might as well, in today's zero trust architecture, assume you're compromised. The question is, how fast can your operations recover? And one of the bigger challenges we see, we work a lot with large military and civilian agencies, and we manage some SIMs and also things like Comply to Connect on the cyber side. But we also do a lot of IT modernization, running applications in data centers, and getting the teams to work well together at enterprise scale is typically one of those larger bureaucratic activities that can be challenging. And so pulling those stakeholders together, doing a robust end-to-end assessment, and so that you know who's managing things like data on the desktop, data on your traditional data centers for file storage, who owns the databases, How are you doing this with object-based storage at your applications? And then using that data, once you've identified it, to assess your cybersecurity posture around it. So how well you can protect that with zero trust principles and policies, how you look at that for end user analytics, and are the right people accessing it, or as a ransomware got in and started encrypting it. So how quick can you respond to isolate? It's extremely critical. And then most importantly, if you're operating the data, and there's typically lots of teams doing this, getting them to think about it at enterprise scale with enterprise operations that are cost optimized, that are looking at all of the data sets in a consolidated order, that has ease of search across the data sets, so you can figure out where ransomware may be attacked and which data sets were compromised, and then being able to restore that quickly and assess that on a regular basis, and also test it so you know it actually works. I can't tell you, having done storage for over 12 years here at Swish, how many times we might work with a client and we walk away, they're all set up, and then things change over time. They don't take care of the system, or they don't care and feed it, or people turn over, policies don't get followed up on, and then they go to do a restore, and maybe it doesn't work because they haven't tested it, they haven't maintained it. That operational excellence across teams is absolutely critical in our largest enterprises in the government.
Great. Yeah, good points. My first question is what is the right balance of trying to prevent the attack in the first place, and then the around the data recovery if it does, because it could happen, right? So what do you, I'm going to start off with you, William. How do you really balance this out, and where do you see the agencies you've worked with kind of maybe fail, or not emphasize one over the other, or is it 50-50?
So my take on that is, a lot of places will try to look at ransomware and say, well, what's the turnkey solution to fix this problem, right? And there is no turnkey solution, because it's not a technique per se. It's it's the end result of a series of attacks or techniques that culminates in ransomware.
Right.
And due to that, basically the most effective way to kind of protect against those types of things is just to have consistent layers of defense in place, just trying to stop the attacker from being able to perform those steps of the attack path. Because in order for ransomware to be successful, they have to have some type of initial access, some type of escalation, some type of lateral movement, each of which of those points could be potential indicators of compromise. So each of those steps would give you an opportunity to detect those things and respond to those things, but also each of those things make it more difficult for the attacker to move forward and finish what they're doing without getting caught. And on that note, ransomware, just generally speaking, is a financially driven attack. So with that being the case, if it's difficult for them to gain access, if it's difficult for them to escalate, they may potentially move on to other lower hanging fruit, like throwing Shodan scans out there, finding out what exists that has, exploits that can be, quick and easy to get that access and get that escalation. So it's one part deterrent, one part kind of slowing them down enough to respond if you have the ability to detect that. And that's kind of my summary on that side of the fence.
Great. Lee, love to hear what you have to say about this.
Absolutely. So I think William is totally right. I was thinking along similar lines, Tom, when you had posed the question, and that is simply to say, you could put a Band-Aid on the solution. There's certainly a lot of innovative solutions coming out in terms of ransomware specific things, such as technology where it will look heuristically in terms of behavior processes to see what is changing in terms of file content and patterns and what's being accessed, what's being not, and suspicious things in memory, et cetera. You could do all that. That's fine. But at the end of the day, if your fortress really looks like it's riddled like Swiss cheese, that's not really a good sign. There's no substitute really for having a very strong foundation in place, because otherwise, whether it's ransomware or otherwise, that likelihood that we heard earlier of it's not if but when, that when's going to be probably a little bit sooner for you, right? So there certainly is that, and I have to say that I've seen a lot of haphazard things happen in terms of cybersecurity. For example, the basics the basic foundation being ignored in terms of controls is, I had mentioned, encryption, firewalls, multi-factor auth, heck, even antivirus, and ensuring that it's something that's even up to date, let alone, one of the newer solutions such as the endpoint detection and response solution, whatever it is. You can't approach no organization, it doesn't matter who they are, how great their incident response team is. If the foundation isn't there, if the fortress hasn't been built properly, I don't think that anyone's really doing a service by buying and implementing a new product just solely to target ransomware. And even if you might have the best ransomware response team in the world specific to that, that will only take you so far. So totally agree with William, totally spot on, but I just also wanted to emphasize a lot of the haphazard realities that I see, frankly.
Right. Good points. Richard?
Thanks, Tom. And I think, again, I think we're all saying a very consistent. I sort of look at that foundation layer that Lee talked about in terms of people, process, and technology. Those three components constantly interact, and you've got to sort of have an understanding across your organization. When I look at my background, having been within the Pentagon, CIO G6, and the DoD CIO, when we actually built some of the risk management framework and using the NIST standard framework for security, it is a layered approach. It's an understanding within the people, the process, and the technology of how they all work collaboratively to sort of build a secure network. It's very consistent with the security that you have in your own home. You can do lots of things there. It's also even the security like fire protection within an own home. You build it in layers. You have people that know how to respond in the event of a fire. Hey, people know where to go. They've tested it, like Lee said before. You train to it. And then also when you get all smoke alarms, you make sure the smoke alarms not only work from a technology standpoint, but now they have advanced systems that give you advanced warning even. And I think this is consistently with what we see all the time. You start with the foundation, you build the training around it, you test the processes. And then when it comes specifically to when I look at technology and I look at what Sean's comment about data, we always come back to the fundamental fact that if it is your data that is being attacked, data really is the lifeblood of today's digital modernization effort. That data needs somehow to be layered in protection as well. You need operational data that we use right now to do the Zoom meeting that we're doing right now, but you're going to make a copy of this. This is a recording. The recording is going to go somewhere. I don't want that recording attacked. You're going to store it someplace, and then hopefully ATAR's also going to put in a geographically separated and probably air gapped, totally separated video. And it's these type of measures that I think that you see. But again, I put it in that basic framework that I've described. Thanks, Tom.
Great. Now you get me nervous. I think I'm going to have to talk to William and look at everything we're doing at ATAR. I don't want to be a victim of ransomware. Now you guys are really doing it to me. Sean?
Sure. Yeah. So layered is the appropriate approach. And if you think of this as a pyramid, the top of the pyramid is definitely the data. That's the valuable, those are the crown jewels in the organization you have to protect. And that data exists around many different points in your enterprise, whether that's the desktop, your file servers in your data center, a line of business's application. It's maybe a SaaS app in the cloud, or maybe it's object-based storage you're using for big data analysis for the mission, like test data or open data around things like NOAA's weather systems and Amazon. And then the bottom line is you need to score that data based on mission criticality and understand what are the things that you absolutely have to have restored, and then build those recovery time objectives and recovery point objective policies around that. And so that you can recover those critical business applications in the appropriate amount of time. Is that 1 hour? Is it 4 hours? Is it 12? But score those things based on a lot of the policies that are available. It's not rocket science, but then make sure you make appropriate investments from a backup and recovery standpoint, and also practice those things on a regular basis so that your team can execute cleanly. Think of yourself as a football team. Somebody needs to be the quarterback running the disaster recovery and your cyber operations, but you're going to have a running back that needs to pick up the ball and run with it and hit the right hole. And if they don't know how to make that play, it may not be successful.
Oh, I love football analogies. Thanks. Yeah, so let me kind of back up a little bit. What is the typical detection time you see in your experience? Maybe starting with you, William. Is it that black screen of death, or with the skull and crossbones, give me $1 million, or what happens? Is that how does this really work in real life, not the movies?
So I can't speak to the just general statistics or general time to respond across agencies and such, because again, I have the offensive side of the house, where I would consider that more on the defensive. But I can speak to my experiences with that. And on that note, before taking this position as deputy chief, I helped build and operate the red team for DHS and then CISA. And in doing so, as one of the things that we do as part of our assessments is a series of what we call measurable events. And the measurable events are things that we do that are intended to specifically trigger a technical control to see what the response to that technical control is. So with typical pen tests, with our RVAs and RPTs that I mentioned earlier, those focus on the technical controls. But as Richard had mentioned, there's people, processes, and technology all involved. And the red team assessments focus on how all three of those interact. So with that red team side, with those measurable events, one of the things that we do, actually number 15, the final measurable event, is ransomware simulation. And typically, once we got to the point of the ransomware simulation, and what we did to simulate that ransomware was we kind of built our own internal tool that didn't actually perform any encryption or anything, because in our operations, we want to make sure we never have a negative effect on our customers, organizations or operations. But what we would do is basically do a desktop takeover that would have a big splash screen with, as you mentioned, the skull and crossbones and all that kind of stuff, and say, hey, you've been hit. We're encrypting your data. There's a little bar that's moving. Send some Bitcoin to, it would be an obfuscated address, so they couldn't actually see or send anything. But basically, we wanted to have them have that panic moment, and then the hope and intent is that they report it. And typically, once we get to that 15th measurable event, and there's generally speaking a very quick response once we actually drop that and run that. The issue is, so in terms of time to respond to it having taken place, it's generally pretty quick. The problem though is when an attacker is able to get to the point to where they can deploy that in the first place. So I would consider the issue not necessarily the speed at which the response takes place, but the fact that an attacker was able to get to the position to deploy the ransomware as being the major issue. So that's my take on that perspective.
Great. How about you, Lee? Got on mute there, I think.
I am totally on mute. I'm sorry. I think it depends certainly upon the organization. I mean, organizations that I've seen where they have that defense in depth approach, that have that DoD mindset really in terms of how you architect, shall we say, precisely your people, processes, and technology to work together. I'd say they detect incidents fairly quickly. It could be ideally within 24 to 48 hours. However, to the extent that certain points in a network aren't being monitored and or certain things aren't being checked, I mean, it can certainly, as we all know, prolong for months, frankly. And that's the unfortunate thing. And, quite frankly, unless one is looking at integrity of logs and things of that sort, attackers know how to delete their trail, so to speak, right? So that no one would necessarily know unless you were looking specifically to see whether, for example, these files have changed and, whether there's no reason why, these files have changed in terms of content that significantly. So, I'd like to say it really varies across the board. We do run annual cybersecurity surveys at HIMSS. We recently have not asked the question in terms of mean time to detect. But on the other hand, I can say, if it's of any interest, we're certainly researching things such as what is the mean time to patch. You know, I think it might be of interest to folks both on the government side and the private sector side to understand that even if there's a critical or a high level patch that you really must patch, unfortunately, we're finding that people don't necessarily patch as quickly as you think that they would, like even same day. Sometimes it could be drawn out for a week, but regardless, I think the general behavior is, given something that's critical enough, there's certainly a quicker cadence in terms of when, you know, these mitigation things happen. It's just not as quick as you might find.
I think we've seen in the cities, they were on Windows 7 and things like that, right? They hadn't done anything, and it hurt them. Richard?
Thanks, Tom. And I think I'm going to talk a lot about what Lee just said. It's interesting, when you're in the government and a hacker is trying to reach the government, they are not really after ransomware. I mean, pretty explicit guidance from the US government is we will not be ransomed, right? So let's talk about the OPM attack. The OPM attack lasted 1.5 years before it was really brought to, we're going to do something about it. Interestingly, it had been recognized way earlier, but no really remediation took place because it's like Lee said, where was the alert that said something is exfiltrating out of the network that shouldn't be? And so those types of activities are really where, you know, when I think about and when I do presentations and meetings with the government, I sort of avoid the term ransomware. Government is looking at its malware, and they are recognizing that when they get infiltrated, the goal is not money. The goal is the information. They are really trying to get credentials out. They're trying to get extraction out. And so the time then is much more difficult. Also, interestingly enough, and I know Sean could talk a lot about this from Swish Data as well, we participated, you know, our capability was in place out at Colorado, and the Colorado CIO and their government network in the state was attacked. And interestingly enough, it was the Commvault data anomaly detection that we said, hey, we see a brand new data source where data is being copied to. Is this something that you haven't told us about, that you are now wanting a new? And it turned out that it was truly an exfiltration to a new source. And it was that alert, ironically, that brought it to their attention. Their cyber sensors had missed everything. So, you know, the timing of it is important. So you have to also recognize, you know, as we all know, cyber works at the speed of light. And so your ability to respond is dependent on that notification and being able to get the alert appropriately. And ever more, it's going to have to be more and more automated. But I think Sean probably has good insight on that as well.
Well, Sean, go ahead.
Certainly. Yeah, one of the things we find that is tough to coordinate, but if you do it well, it can be very effective, is the ability to look at broad sets of analytics. So we manage a SIM for about an 85,000 person organization, and pulling those alerts in and looking at the telemetry full stack. So not just the endpoint telemetry, not just basic log data, not just net flow in the network, but things also deep around single sign-on or analytics, or if you have application layer or data security tools, pulling those different alerts in the analytics together into a single data lake, and then building the alerts around that, the indicators of compromise and highlighting those, and then feeding in threat intelligence to look for that stuff near real time, because it's that 0-day attack or the ability to find those brand new IOCs that came out 3 hours ago. That is absolutely critical in that data lake to highlight. But think of your teams having different expertises, right? The SOC and cybersecurity guys are extremely broad in scopes. They see lots of things and there's tons of data. But your data team or your application owner or your database admin or your cloud application team building 3 different clouds on functions as a service are all very narrowly scoped and have a laser focus on their specific part of the area practice or the architecture. And their ability to alert and see something and making sure those alerts are fed into the SOC or your enterprise operations center is critical. And then again, the ability to pull the teams together and run the plays to recover the data, to isolate the assets, to pull the forensics with things like RPA agents or bots, to pull the picture together in very, very rapidly, to know what happened, assess it, quarantine things and recover data is important. On average, the average American business, not large business, just average small to mid business, has about a $2 million impact to their business on the average ransomware attack. So when you think of your enterprise, your SLAs for your critical systems might having a 4-hour recovery time objective being back up, but really measuring the reality of the impact. At $2 million of business impact, most organizations, once they're attacked with ransomware, aren't recovering in 4 hours. And we saw that with people like Colonial Pipeline or some of the meat process and packing systems. These are big orgs that were targeted to disrupt operations at national levels. And they're massive organizations. They're not small companies. And their impact was tens or hundreds of millions of dollars or $1 billion in economic impact. So take this very seriously, assess your data, but have your teams work well together at it. It's a team activity.
Yeah, and I think you got the cost, but the cost to your reputation, those are hard to quantify. They're a lot higher than the actual like recovery mode. And then, yeah, so it's bad. So William, your team's done a great job. You've penetrated, your adversary, and you're in. I know your offense. What chess move should the defender make? How do you recover from ransomware? What's the checklist say? What is the ConOps for that you've seen, including obviously, taking, and somebody had a question to this thing. Obviously, you've got to recover the data. But what things do you need to do as an organization?
So I'm certainly not an incident responder and don't claim to be, but just in terms of just generality, of course, some kind of triage, bringing down any of the infected systems while also coordinating with getting the backups brought back online and everything along those lines as well to restore the data. But just as critical would also be coordinating with the ISACs, with federal protection, such as FBI or any of those other groups that can help coordinate and on the law enforcement side some type of response. Additionally, because they may have information. So for example, if you say, hey, I was hit with XYZ ransomware, they're asking for this much ransom, they might say, hey, we actually just went through this and we found a public decryption key, and so they might be able to help in that sense as well with the restoration, as in addition to the legal side of the fence. So as it was mentioned by Sean a minute ago, it is a team activity, and that's across the board. That's also in that response. So you want to have legal involved. You want to have your leadership involved in keeping them apprised, but you want to bring in the incident responders to do the triage, to start working on data back. You want to get the sysadmins on board to help, make sure the data is accurate and make sure everything is accounted for. So across the board, there's a lot of people that would need to kind of come together. And granted, not everyone's going to have the capability to do all of that, because again, if you're a small organization versus a federal agency, you may not have the time, money, and resources, or you might have that is your sysadmin, your armchair lawyer, and all those other things all kind of rolled into one. But the key point is when it comes to those types of steps, a lot of things need to happen kind of concurrently. So in order to make that happen, it's best to practice that ahead of time and do incident response tabletop exercises and do your risk assessments and coordinate with those individuals and keep them in the loop so that if something does happen, you're already trained and you know what you need to do.
Yeah, that goes back to Sean's quarterback, who's the running back, who's the wide receiver. Lee? I think Lee might have to step away or something. She's having some issues. How about we'll go to you, Richard.
So I'm going to sort of piggyback immediately on what William and Sean both said. So when you're doing incident response, having managed this at the DoD level, the very first thing is you validate the incident, you really validate the attack, you validate that it's not just a communication interruption. You immediately start this triage activity that has been well practiced. You cannot do it at the incident time. If you've never done it and you're seeing something, it really becomes very, very, very unmanageable very quickly. But remember, a lot of times the first activities too, a lot of people think the knee-jerk reaction is to shut it down. Believe it or not, at least within government networks especially, the first reaction is, hey, wait a minute. The minute you shut it down, you alert the adversary that we know they're there. And sometimes that's not the best way to do it. Sometimes you want to honeypot their attack. You want to start finding out how they got in. And so there's some traceability. Again, that team effort that Sean mentioned and William, sort of came back with, saying, hey, this is the right way. But then once you do realize that you are under attack and you need to isolate, you need to practice the efforts. You need to have those automated ways to start shutting down. Some of those automated ways of shutting down can be instantaneous, from a meaning that you already automated using RPA type capabilities. But other ways, you just want to make sure that you are tracking and making sure that whatever attack has doesn't spread. And then you begin the recovery effort once you've got the attack under control. And that it's sort of logical, but it's that step-by-step process.
Well, I think what everybody wants to do is do what you see in the movies, just unplug everything. You know, it's like in a panic before the AI takes over the
Exactly.
world.
Yeah. Wait a minute. Let's just shut it down. They've got our network down.
Right. And I think that some companies have done it, and it hasn't worked out that great, because then they had to So,
Yeah,
Sean,
Colonial Pipeline sort of took a hit for that one, I think. Anyway.
right. Sean, you want to add something?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, when we get into the what to do, it depends on your agency's playbook and how you want to respond, and that probably varies depending on the application or asset. So you need to know different plays to run. But what we've found most useful when we look at kind of compromised systems is trying to go back and figure out, when did it start? When's the difference in what happened? How'd they get in there? And what are they doing right now? So you think of something like SolarWinds Sunburst, for example, you need to investigate that. And often what we find is that the network traffic analysis, that NDR function, network detection response, using very intelligent tools that look at all the network data, tend to be very interesting places to start to figure out when the communications anomalies changed, and how do we track down which hosts they penetrated from, where they moved laterally, which hosts are speaking out on ports or protocols or to applications they historically haven't spoke to. That's a great place to start with that. And if you learn that for your past attacks, then you can set alerts to find it very quickly in future attacks. And that's been very successful with a lot of our clients. And that uses some machine learning and anomaly detection for things like ports, protocols, and services that you probably define in your authority to operate plan. But you don't instrument in alerts on what is a approved communication and what's not for certain applications, special lateral movement. The other thing is the ability to pivot into deep transactional analytics of what happened at the application layer or at the OS layer becomes a nice pivot point at that point. And so having, again, that data in a place where you can essentially look at a lot of it, or know how to right-click pivot swivel chair ops from, say, your security tools to maybe your deep observability tools to say what database query was ran by this attacker with this credential, so you know the exact records that were impacted or which databases were queried and called, becomes really powerful when you have say an application performance management team or an application team doing deep security workflows that complement what the SOC is doing with NDR tools or extended detection response, or looking at endpoints or the network as well. And then it's, again, how far back does it go? And this gets back to when you do your assessment, your plan. If you assume the attacker's been in for, say, 30 days, 60 days, 180 days, you need to figure that out with your IOCs, backtrack it, because then that gives you a point of what image am I going to recover to? Am I recovering from an image last week that's pretty recent, or do I need to recover from a cold stored image out in AWS Glacier that's 3 months old because they've been in my network for 90 plus days?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point. I'm not scared of many people, but I am scared of the CP credit people. And this is to get your CP credits, you have to do these polls, which are fantastic, actually. So I want to make sure we sneak these in. Sometimes I forget and get in trouble. So we're going to go ahead and do these, and we'll talk about the results. So currently our data all on-prem, in the cloud, hybrid, unsure. And if you're a contractor, you have government customers. So if everybody can answer this really fairly quickly, I think most of our engaged audience has a quick trigger. So we'll do this pretty quickly. Okay, can we see the poll results? Hybrid. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So people, I think that's the federal government, isn't it? I don't think everybody's 100% in the cloud and people aren't on-prem anymore. I think people are doing both, which probably makes things difficult.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. I'll jump in on here and
Go ahead.
I'll say absolutely. Every agency that we're working with, from both the federal government at the enterprise level or the banks and the hospitals, they definitely want a hybrid solution. They recognize that they have to have a certain amount of data on hand to do their operational day-to-day work, but then they are slowly moving into the cloud. A lot of not understanding, and there's a little bit of a difficulty in the transition, stuff like that. But now you're seeing that in the case of the federal government, they've really defaulted that they are going to do a full hybrid model. They recognize they're always going to have some on-prem. They're actually going to have some regional data centers to support some larger business, the logistics centers, et cetera, et cetera. And then they are moving their largest enterprise, their people management and other systems into the cloud.
Lee, what have you seen with your government customers? Is that pretty standard with the hybrid? Maybe talk about why they do hybrid.
Sure. I mean, I'm not really, while I volunteer with these various agencies, I'm not really on the inside per se, so I can't speak to that, but I can certainly speak from a healthcare private sector perspective. And I could say totally hybrid. There's definitely concordance around that. And I can say, why is this important? It's especially important for private sector, at least to the extent that you exchange data internationally, and EU GDPR is relevant, because you absolutely need to understand where your data is, and essentially a map of how your data is flowing, where's it going, which of course is also essential to information assurance, right? I think that's rule number one. So I have to say, hybrid certainly makes sense. But I also have to say as well, a few hidden pitfalls of that is, even if you're hybrid and even if there's a perception that cloud may be really secure, I think I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that for any of us that maybe even for fun have poked around and have done a little bit of Google dorking, there's a massive amount of, unfortunately, unsecure, confidential information that's floating out there of all types, and it's just mind-boggling and amazing. So while we might say, oh, why aren't you going to the cloud? You have to appropriately manage and secure the cloud and be on the lookout for any leaks. And also, frankly, shadow IT, where, like I said, Google Docs or otherwise, people think that it's secure, not knocking on Google or anyone else, but, it's just a question of if you've locked it down sufficiently, if you can.
Well, I'm going to go to the offensive mind and cyber guy. So when you see an enterprise, they've got people, they've got, what's the biggest vulnerability? Is it the application? Do you look at whether it's in the cloud or on bare metal? What is going through your head? I just kind of want to know, because everybody's in a hybrid situation. What should they watch out for?
I would say generally, from my perspective, the biggest issues with things in the cloud is how new it is in terms of people moving to it and leveraging it as a platform. So, we have a long and storied history of managing and protecting on-prem, but moving into the cloud, there's not as much experience in terms of, boots on ground people doing it. And so they may be able to administer it and, and manage it effectively, but they may not understand all the security practices that are required. And depending on the service, there can be a lot of tools and capabilities that can really bolster what an organization can do through leveraging the cloud. But in doing so, they may be opening up, cracks in the armor, so to speak, without even realizing it until it's potentially maybe too late, until someone's already got access to that data. They may be hosting, for example, their public keys in what they think is a secure area. But as Lee mentioned, through that Google dorking, hey, found all this information that we can now access, which basically, in a nutshell, leads to new types of attack paths that, generally speaking, may not be at the forethought of what people are used to working with. So, because when you typically think of securing things, you think of keeping things patched, watching, like network traffic and flow and things like that. But with everything being in the cloud, you're essentially hosting all of your stuff on someone else's infrastructure. So you have to have an innate trust in them in terms of them being stewards of your data. And then B, in terms of how you interact with it, since it's not on-prem, you have to have some method to, get to the door, to walk through the door, and then to interact with the data. And with that being, again, comparatively a newer method, a lot of organizations may or may not have the experience to be able to lock those types of things down effectively. So that's my kind of big picture thoughts on that.
Great. Thank you, William. Sean?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the main things we have to think about is how do we secure that in those layers we talked about earlier. And what we see a lot of our large, federal clients doing is building this, cloud security layer that's enterprise wide. So it's fronting many of their cloud-based applications, and they're looking at it holistically across their multi-cloud or hybrid cloud environment. And so one of the biggest challenges is selecting a robust solution that can scale. And typically that means it's deployed as an over-the-top solution out on the internet in enterprise class fashion, right? A cloud horizontally scalable cloud architecture. And then limiting the things behind that from, say, a private access architecture, so that your users have to authenticate into the cloud security framework and then get in. And they were monitoring things at the full stack application layer, meaning decrypting things, looking for bad actors, re-authenticating constantly, and doing scoring of the users in a zero trust architecture constantly, right? So if Joe logs in from Singapore, but Joe normally works from Virginia and he's already logged into Virginia, probably not Joe in Singapore, right? So let's keep that guy out, even if he authenticated appropriately. Now, the other thing we run is the Northern Virginia DevSecOps meetup at Swish. We have about almost 1,000 members. So maybe after this webcast, we'll cross 1,000, but we're about 930 right now. We've been running it for over 2 years. And what we find is a lot of focus on the application layer of security, things like static application security testing, dynamic application security testing, fuzz testing. And a lot of the compromises we find on the cloud side today is really at the application layer. And it might be interjected inadvertently by a developer. So doing scanning and compliance is great, and you can do compliance assessments in the cloud, but doing application scans on a regular basis on every version you deploy and making that an automated action becomes critical to just make sure you pull security left into your development practices, and you're cleaning those things up proactively with your cyber team when you're told you have a compromise, and solving that in 2 or 3 hours, not 2 or 3 weeks.
Great. Well, we're getting closer to the end than the beginning here. It'd be great to get, as the final questions, something we didn't cover, but what are some of the things that you've seen in your experience that's going to help prevent ransomware? Any other tidbits? Maybe we'll start off with you, William. Something maybe we hadn't had a chance to talk about.
So, as mentioned, the assessments we perform it'll be federal, state, local, tribal, territorial, and critical infrastructure key resource. So we do everything from national agencies to very small, like 2-employee organizations, in the Midwest kind of thing. So what I've seen with a lot of the smaller organizations is the issue is usually funding. So they don't typically have the money for the IDSs, the third-party monitoring and detection, the reporting, and all those kinds of things. So in those types of situations, I personally believe that 70% is better than 0%, essentially. So instead of having to wait 2 years to implement Nessus at $4,000, just for example, you can at least in the meantime go ahead and use like OpenBoss or some other open source scanning tool that can still do a lot of those capabilities at a cheaper or free cost in some cases. So I know that in terms of the layers of protection, a lot of people are immediately thinking dollar signs and what does this mean for me? But through research, you can find either publicly built tools or provided tools, or tools made by organizations that are at a cheaper cost that can still meet a lot of those needs to help build up those layers of security and help put those protections in place, even if you don't have the big budget. It might take a little more research, a little more legwork, but that, again, like with ransomware, the layers being the best method of defense, that proactive side is typically going to be better to pay a little bit for those tools than to pay a ransom. So, and then that's my thoughts on that.
Great. How about you, Lee?
Thanks. So I think for sure that the key is blocking as much as you can and tackling where you can't block, of course. So I think it's very important, of course, to really concentrate on regular phishing exercises that are simulated, keeping track of your repeat offenders, keeping track of metrics in terms of the efficacy of your security awareness training programs, the industry averages across all critical infrastructure from our surveys and other surveys that we've aggregated. It's about 10% for each sector on average. Some are a little bit better than others. But certainly within any organization, obviously the fewer clicks and real, threats to your organization, the better. And I have to say that in terms of tackling, one thing that we didn't address is if you do have an incident, make sure that there's a really clear message in terms of who you report, what kind of incident to whom. Because I've seen, at least in private sector, many incidents where a security incident is reported to the privacy officer. They don't have the lingo or understanding or even background generally to understand what's happening in terms of even the simplest kind of security incident, not to malign them, it's just true, it's just not in their vocab. So it's really important to make sure that reporting occurs appropriately. Otherwise, there is a delay, and even if the privacy officer might be bright and capable, there likely will be critical information and time, frankly, that's lost in, conveying it to others.
Great. How about you, Richard?
So I appreciate it. So I really think I'll go back with what Sean said. We know where a lot of the attacks do occur. They occur at the apps layer. So my comment would be: do your due diligence. Look for something that has a certification that somebody's actually scanned it. Look for that FedRAMP citation for your cloud environment, for your applications, for your operations environment. So I think that's just a critical aspect. I keep going back to people, process, and technology. This is a integrated network, and it is all about people, process, and technology. It's got to be tested. You've got to be diligent. You've got to be persistent, and you've got to have active discipline. I come back to, are you ready? You need to really think about that. Are you ready? And you've got to get all layers looked at and working together as a team.
Great. Sean, I'm going to give you the last word on this webinar today.
Well, thank you, Tom. Yeah, I think when you think of are you ready, often it's hard to make that assessment and be unbiased yourself. And so I would challenge most organizations to step back and take a look at it themselves, but don't be shy of inviting in a third party, somebody like a consultant like Swish possibly, to look at it from different angles, different perspectives, assess it across a robust set of controls, and bring in maybe some fresh perspectives from other organizations they've interacted with. Often that's very valuable. And the other thing that's valuable too is to look at that from a cultural assessment. So we often look at and measure things like, how does your culture work, much like in a DevOps community, but do it at a broader level so you understand how you work together in a single team and also in a multi-team system. And this has found where a lot of organizations can move from being, operationally maybe inefficient and not working well together to understanding how they can work better together. And when you can build a very generative culture where messengers are enabled and they're empowered and people are highly trusted, you can do amazing things together as a team. And that's where I think our government leaders have an amazing opportunity to work across the different teams and make their organizations operate that much better. But more importantly, be prepared when they are attacked and be able to respond extremely efficiently and confidently.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Sean. And just kind of brainstorming, ATARC has a zero trust lab. Many vendors are in that. What if we did a ransomware lab? Where we have different vendors in there and we're trying stuff, get William to prove it out with his offensive capability. And we can come out with some best practices, come out with, let's try this, let's try that. And that is going to take a little bit of thought, but I think that's my big takeaway out of this. It seems like we can definitely do that. So thank you all today. This has been great. I've learned a lot, and I think the audience has too. So William, Sean, Richard, and Lee, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Have a great day.
Great.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. So next, our next event, we're going to put that up there for a second. Improving nation cybersecurity with event data. And that's coming up on November 2nd. So we've got a good power pack line up there, but I will let everybody go and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.